Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm continuing on the series I'm doing now, talking about creation, evolution, and science. And tonight we're going to be talking about intelligent design. So I've got David Pallman, who runs the YouTube channel Faith Because of Reason, here with me this evening to talk about intelligent design. So how are you doing this evening, David?
I'm doing excellent, Phil. Thank you so much for having me on.
Fantastic. Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for coming on. So I invited you on to talk about intelligent design because I saw on Facebook and on your YouTube channel that you're an advocate of that position, and I thought that was a good way to go after having Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy on to talk about theistic evolution. But before we dive into that, for people who aren't familiar with you, haven't seen your YouTube channel, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing there?
Yeah, sure. I'm a Christian apologist, or an amateur Christian apologist, whichever you prefer to consider me. I study ministry and apologetics at Trinity Theological Seminary. As you mentioned, I run the Faith Because of Reason YouTube channel, actually going through a series on intelligent design right now. I defend the Pallman cosmological argument, the reliability of the New Testament, the resurrection of Jesus, and then theologically, I defend Arminian theology, Molinism, Orthodox preterism, conditional immortality, and, of course, intelligent design.
Okay. Cool, good deal. And where is you said? Sorry, which school did you say you're going to right now? Trinity something? I missed that.
That's Trinity Theological Seminary.
Ah, where is that located? I'm not familiar with that school.
It's an online school, but they're based out of Evansville, Indiana.
Oh, okay, good deal, fantastic. And so you're doing all this apologetic work just because you're doing it like in your spare time, just because you enjoy doing this and you see value in it, or?
Mostly, I just have a passion for apologetics, to see Christians become more well-thought, more well-read people who are, actually know why they believe what they believe. And so, Inspiring Philosophy, who you had on last, he inspired me with his channel. He just had these really good bite-sized videos, and I was like, well, I know how to make videos, so I can do that too. But I try to hit some topics that he doesn't hit, or that I knew he would never hit. So I did the Pallman cosmological argument because he doesn't seem to argue for that. So I did a few videos on that, and now I'm doing intelligent design because I knew he held the theistic evolution, so I knew he would never do a series on that. So
yeah. If I could be wrong, but I think I recall hearing him mention at some point that he doesn't really care for the Pallman cosmological argument. But if I got that wrong, my apologies. But I think I remember him saying that at some point. So
that would seem to be the case. Part of that may be that he's a B theorist, although in one of my videos I did argue that Pallman is compatible with B theory. But I don't know if that has anything to do with his holding to B theory of time.
Oh, that's interesting. I actually, this is kind of a side note to talking about intelligent design, but that's fine. I don't care. I remember hearing actually William Lane Craig talk one time that he was thinking up-and-coming philosophers and apologists should try to find ways to apply the Pallman to a B theory of time. So that seems great to me that you've even attempted to do so.
Yeah, I was pulling on the work of Andrew Loke and Curtis J. Metcalf have argued a lot for that, so I just basically presented their arguments.
Cool. Well, that's fantastic. Awesome. Well, I hope people check out what you're doing on your YouTube channel there. I listened to a couple of the things you were doing on intelligent design in preparation for our conversation tonight, and it seemed to me you were giving a pretty good presentation of it, and I thought, yeah, I've asked the right guy to come on and talk to me. So, all right.
Well, thank you.
Oh, yeah, you're most welcome. So why don't we just go ahead and dive right into that then? Let me open my... So what would you say is intelligent design or ID theory? How would you classify that?
So it's a theory of origins, primarily biological organisms, or the origin of biological organisms, and we infer intelligence as being the best explanation for certain features in biological structures and in the universe in general, but it becomes particularly controversial in the area of biology. And it's largely a forensic science, so this deals a lot with the beginnings of things, how things come about, sometimes called origin science. And a key feature of it is that we have an open philosophy of science, and that means that we reject methodological naturalism, or any idea that science can only explain things by reference to purely materialistic or physical causes. So intelligent design takes that whole philosophy and says that that's a bad rule for science, that puts an unnecessary barrier or an unnecessary restraint on us that precludes us from considering the full range of possibilities. And so it's very important that we have clear that intelligent design is not compatible with methodological naturalism.
Okay. And I know you gave us a short definition of it there, but broadly speaking, what would broadly speaking, what would you define methodological naturalism as? How do you categorize that as opposed to intelligent design?
I define methodological naturalism as the belief that one can only explain certain phenomena in the natural world, or any phenomena in the natural world rather, by reference to purely physical or materialistic causes. So
okay,
everything, there's no appeals to supernatural, no appeals to anything that would be non-physical. Everything has to be explained purely in terms of things like wind, water, erosion, known physical causes are the only types of explanations that are allowed.
So would there then, you say, like, be cases where that's actually an appropriate thing to turn to, like, for example, if you're studying geology or plate tectonics or something like that?
For the theist, no. For the theist, I would agree with Alvin. Alvin Planting has said that a theist should always, consider. Well, I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but he basically said that we should always consider our full range of options that we believe in. And so, if we are theists and we believe that there is such a thing as God, then that always is going to have to. We're always going to have to hold the door open to that possibility. But even as a non-theist, I think even the atheist, I think it's unwise to have methodological naturalism, because short of a proof for atheism, which there's generally, a general consensus that there is no such thing as a proof for atheism, even if you are an atheist, I think it would be unwise to close the door to any possibility of ever, having that belief in atheism falsified. So methodological naturalism is just an arbitrary rule. It has no justification, and is ultimately a science stopper, because it just says you can't consider possibilities beyond a certain point. Like, I like to think of it as, say there's like a house, and some police or detectives come upon this house, and there's a murderer, right? And it's a 2-story house, and they know that the murderer is still in the building, but the police chief says you can only check the bottom floor. You cannot check the upstairs. Well, why is that? There's just no good, the atheist might object, but we don't know that there is an upstairs. But this is like, if there's stairs leading up, and the police chief says, no, we can't consider the possibility of an upstairs. You're not allowed to do that. We can only check the bottom floor here. That's kind of how I look at methodological naturalism. It's just, it puts this restraint there that doesn't need to be there. Why should we eliminate supernatural explanations from consideration?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good analogy, and I'm very much inclined to agree with you, at least in principle. But I also know that people who are in favor of something like methodological naturalism would want to argue back against you, saying something along the lines of, "But look, we know that natural forces cause these things. You referenced like wind and water erosion. We know that water erosion causes things to causes canyons and things like that to come about because we've observed it. So why not conclude that, say, the Grand Canyon was formed by natural water erosion over a long period of time, as opposed to positing some other cause?"
Sure, and I would have no problem with that. If we know that natural forces are sufficient to account for something, then I have no problem invoking those, right? So an open philosophy of science doesn't say you can't consider natural or physical causes. It just wants to expand beyond that. It says we don't have to only consider that. So if we come across something that we don't know what the explanation is for it, that's, something not like the Grand Canyon, but when we come across something like DNA, right? An open philosophy of science says there is no reason to restrict ourselves to purely material causes. When we don't know the origin for something, then we should be able to consider non-material, non-physical causes as well.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. And intuitively, where my mind went next is, well, what if you see like a something written out in a language chiseled on the side of a cliff somewhere? Well, we naturally look at that and assume that was the cause of somebody doing that. That was the cause of an agent. That wasn't the cause of water and wind erosion and other natural forces. We just immediately jump to that was some type of agent that did that.
Right, yeah.
Okay. So, well, I like that where you're going with that. That seems right to me to not rule out not in a sense rule out the natural causes, but to say we need to be at least open to the possibility there's more going on, because in our day-to-day lives, we do that all the time. If I see a cup of coffee left out for me in the morning, I'm not going to assume that, the wind and rain and water did that. I'm going to assume my wife made me a cup of coffee. So.
Right, yeah. And, even if it's something that you don't have a precedent for, if you're, if your window, if you wake up one morning, your window's broken, you come downstairs and the window's broken, you don't have to assume it was natural forces. That could have been an intelligent agent who, threw a rock through your window. So you should be able to consider both options.
Okay, good deal. So, do you find that there's like a good and or bad definitions of intelligent design? Like you gave the one earlier that. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, sorry. Yeah, I was saying I'm actually really glad that you brought this question up, because the mainstream media and like proponents of theistic and atheistic evolution like to define intelligent design as being the study of natural things that are too complex to have evolved. And that's not really a fair definition, because that immediately sets intelligent design up to be a purely negative case, right? If we're only arguing against other explanations like, say, evolution, that it can't account for something like the bacterial flagellum or DNA or something like that, then then it takes away the positive case that we're making. So I would define intelligent design as being the study of patterns in nature that are best explained as the result of an intelligent cause rather than an unintelligent cause. That way, it makes it clear that we are very much making a positive case and that we're not just arguing against evolution. Okay.
Yeah, I like that. And where my mind wants to go then to is, well, in practical reality, what's the distinction? How would we make that distinction between the negative case and the positive one? Is it something we just kind of intuitively do, where I rule out the natural explanation when I see the message carved into the rock wall? Or how do we go from that saying intelligent design is showing us that evolution or natural forces can't do these things to here's the positive case for why this is the way it is? And that might be jumping ahead a little bit. If so, I apologize.
No, yeah, that's fine. This is actually good, because this is philosophy of science that we're dealing with here, and that's good, because that actually should precede the evidence itself. And so, so that's a question of how is inference to the best explanation to be formulated, right? Like, what's the criteria for best explanation of the facts? And so what we would say in forensic science, right, when you're studying the past, which is mainly what intelligent design does, is and Charles Darwin Darwin and Lyell came up with this, that you should explain something in the past by reference to causes that are acting in the present that are known to produce similar effects, right? Okay. So if we know of something in the present that can cause something that, obviously we can't observe, or we can't have the origin of life. We can't have that happen again. We can't recreate that in a laboratory. So we know that life is based on DNA, which is a form of information. So we would ask the question, then what cause now in operation can cause that sort of effect? And we know that the only answer that we currently know of is intelligence. So intelligence becomes the best explanation. So the way you determine the best explanation is by reference to causes that are currently in effect that are known to produce similar phenomena.
Okay, so if I'm following you right, to go back to my example of the message chiseled on the side of a cliff, and to the best of my knowledge, nobody else has ever seen wind erosion and other things like that producing a message on the side of a cliff written in a language. But we've seen lots of agents, lots of human beings doing things like that, doing similar things, and we've got records of lots of human beings doing similar things like that. So that's what I would want to go to, because that's a cause that I've seen producing that effect, and there's lots of documentation of that cause producing that effect.
Right, so that becomes the best explanation of the facts until, unless someone could produce evidence that that wind, water, and erosion could cause that kind of effect. Until then the best explanation, in this case, the only explanation you know of, would be intelligence.
Okay, yeah, I like that. That's I've done a couple of podcasts on how inference to the best explanation works, and I think that's a pretty good shorthand way of putting it. You can now obviously you can get much more technical, but yeah, I think that's a pretty good shorthand way of putting it. So yeah, okay. And you said earlier that it was good we're doing this because this is philosophy of science has to precede the evidence, and my podcast is about philosophy. I think philosophy has to precede everything. So.
You're quite right.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be told I'm right on my own podcast. So, so my next question I've got for you is, do you find that there are examples of theories that are like or very similar to ID in other disciplines? Like you mentioned before that it was a forensic science, and that makes me immediately think of all the criminal forensic shows that are on TV, and that my wife and I have watched some true crime documentaries, and they get into things like that. So is it kind of comparable or similar, or what would you say about that?
I would say that intelligent design in every field, it's assumed that it's a legitimate science in every field, or a legitimate form of study, a legitimate type of explanation, let's say, for every field of study. And biology is the only field, and maybe in physics and stuff, but basically, except for places where it wouldn't have divine implications, it's considered completely valid. So, for example, an example would be archaeology, right? Let's say some archaeologists discover some pottery, arrowheads, hieroglyphics, something like that. No one is going to insist that these artifacts must be explained by purely natural causes like wind, water, erosion. Instead, we know that no natural cause can account for the origin of these artifacts, but intelligence can in our experience. So when an archaeologist finds an arrowhead, he's allowed to attribute that to an intelligent agent. You mentioned forensics before. Police and detectives assume that they can tell when somebody died as the result of natural causes or when someone died as the result of an intelligent agent. So in forensics, as you mentioned, is very much allowed. We're very much allowed to make inferences to intelligence. In SETI research, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, we assume that there are certain earmarks of intelligence, right? Like they said, a series of prime numbers or something, as like sound waves or something, then we could detect that would be from an intelligent agent. So basically every field of study, we recognize that there are intelligent causes and there are non-intelligent causes, and that we can tell the difference between these two, and you're allowed to make the inference to either one depending on what the evidence allows. So it's really only biology that there's this sort of rule that, you can't do that here.
Yeah. I've had kind of a similar thought before maybe you could. I guess the only way to come back on that would be to say that it's for some reason not appropriate to do that in biology, even though it's acceptable in all the other fields of study. But the only reason I can come up with that is to just kind of assume what you're trying to prove and say it's because it's all by naturalistic processes. It's in a certain sense begging the question, you're either going to be arguing in a circle.
Right. It's either going to be begging the question or else is just going to be completely arbitrary, and so like almost like special pleading, because if every other field is allowed to do this, you've got to give us some sort of justification for why this one field is going to be the exception.
Yeah, exactly, which is that's perfectly appropriate in other fields of study. There's a reason why I'm not getting a good example of that coming to my mind right now, but there's a reason why the laws of the United States don't apply to you if you're in Australia. That's perfectly legitimate and obvious. And so they need to do something similar to that to say why appeals to intelligent agents aren't appropriate in biology, but they are everywhere else.
Right. And I mean, it's one thing if you say, to say, well, we don't need to make the appeal to intelligence because it can be explained through evolution, then that's fine. We can have the conversation there. But when you try to invoke methodological naturalism as sort of like this a priori way of ruling out intelligence as an explanation from the get-go, that's a problem, because that is trying to shut the conversation down before it even begins. And that's not good science.
Oh yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. You should never arbitrarily rule anything out if you're going to be doing good philosophy and good science. You have to do your best to consider all the possibilities and then kind of weed them out. Where if it is the case that somebody's saying, as I think Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy tried to argue with me when I had him on, that evolution just is the best explanation of all these things, then he's in a certain sense doing what you're trying to do with intelligent design, where he's saying evolution is the best explanation, therefore I'm going to go with that. He's not arbitrarily ruling it out from the get-go.
Yeah, that's completely acceptable. I'm willing to have the conversation at that point, and we can talk about that and let people reach their own conclusion. But it's something completely different when you're like trying to appeal to this or arbitrary rule to say, well, I'm not going to allow us to even have the conversation because of this. That's a problem when there's no justification for that rule.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there. There's been many times when I've been listening to lectures by philosophers on various topics, and they'll make a assumption where they'll just rule something out from the get-go, and I would say to myself, well, I'd make a mental note, or somebody was listening to me, I'd say to them, you just can't do that. You have to give me a reason why you're throwing that possibility out. Otherwise, you're not doing good thinking. So, okay. So moving on then, do you think it's possible that do you find that intelligent design is incompatible with evolutionary theory? And I realize that could be a very complicated question, because evolutionary theory is a broad subject and there are many variants therein. So I imagine the simplest answer would be it's probably incompatible with some aspects of it and not some others.
Right. I would say it really depends on how we're defining evolution, because there are a lot of different definitions. It's kind of a slippery word. So, if it just means change over time, no one is really going to dispute that happens. As even young earth creationist Paul Nelson says, and I love this quote, he says, even the most rock-ribbed fundamentalist knows that living organisms change over time. So, nobody who knows, who's studied this in any detail is going to deny that some change happens, right? And I mean, that can be called evolution, right? There's evolutions of cultures, there's evolution of technology. So, no one denies evolution if you just are applying, something like that to biology. Evolution could just mean common descent, right? The idea that all organisms descend from a common ancestor. Now, while most intelligent design proponents, including myself, are skeptical of that or either oppose that, that's not technically incompatible with intelligent design, as long as intelligence is still detectable, right? Like Michael Behe, for example, would be a very eminent proponent of intelligent design, and he accepts common ancestry. In his book, The Edge of Evolution, he even offers some arguments for it.
Okay.
So intelligent design is compatible with common descent. What it's not compatible with is any sort of evolution that is going to say that purely naturalistic forces are sufficient to account for all of the diversity and complexity of life. So neo-Darwinism is we spend most of our time opposing, because that's kind of like the academy view right now, or mainstream view. And so according to neo-Darwinism, mutation and natural selection, that mechanism is sufficient to account for all the complexity in biological organisms. And of course, that definition is incompatible with intelligent design because it removes any need for designing intelligence in the development of life on Earth. So for intelligent design to have any credibility, design needs to be empirically detectable. And neo-Darwinism just removes that detectability. So intelligent design is incompatible with any version of evolutionary theory which believes that purely naturalistic forces can account for life.
Okay, but it would then be compatible with any variant of evolutionary theory that would say some naturalistic forces are responsible for the variance in life? Maybe even, this is just kind of an arbitrary number, but maybe even like, say, 60-70% of the variants we see are attributable to natural causes, but then the other percent you would want to appeal to intelligence for.
Yeah, you could even say, like, so for example, if you want to say that intelligence is necessary for the origin of life, but then beyond that, life was able to completely develop on its own, I would contest that on other grounds, but that's technically compatible with intelligent design because you're saying intelligence is necessary at a certain level. So as long as design is detectable at some level, and then it's compatible with intelligent design. But at the point that you want to rule intelligence out and say there's no need to rule or appeal to intelligence because this can purely be accounted for by forces that we know are in existence, then it becomes incompatible with intelligent design.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. So, so do you tend to work off the definition of evolution as Darwinism or neo-Darwinism, or is that how you work with that, or?
It's generally what I assume. So if somebody says I'm an evolutionist or I believe in evolution, it's pretty safe to assume they mean neo-Darwinism. I know Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy, we went back and forth on this a little bit. He does think that's correct because I know he holds to extended evolutionary synthesis, but normally it's going to mean neo-Darwinism. And so, like I said, there can be a lot of variation with what the word means, but normally if someone is talking about biological evolution, then it's neo-Darwinism. So I would assume neo-Darwinism unless the specific proponent gives me a reason to think otherwise.
Yeah, I found in my experience that's pretty much the case as well, at least the academics I've talked to. Maybe if you're actually talking to biologists and evolutionary biologists, that is not the case, because they would probably be much more aware of flaws in neo-Darwinism and up-and-coming theories and things along those lines. But for the most part, most of the people I talk to when they're talking about evolution, they mean Darwinism or neo-Darwinism or something very, very much like that.
Right.
Okay. So just a final definitionary question. Do you find intelligent design to be a religious or an inherently religious theory? And if not, why is it often presented as it is? Because very often when it's talked about in the press, people say this is a religious or inherently religious theory.
Sure. So it's most definitely not religious in any way. We use standard methods of scientific inquiry. We reason from scientific data to conclusions. So there's no religious premise in the argument of intelligent design, right? Things that we bring forward as evidence, like the Cambrian explosion or the bacterial flagellum or DNA code. These are not, religious items. These are not religious texts. This is just data that we're observing in the natural world that we're making an inference to an intelligent cause from. Or as Stephen Meyer says, intelligent design is an inference based on scientific evidence, not a deduction based on religious authority. So it's often presented as a religious theory by critics because that's kind of an easy way to discredit it. At least that's what I think. It's an easy way to discredit the argument without actually engaging with it. And it's just worth noting here that the movement includes agnostics such as David Berlinski and Michael Denton. We've got Jews like David Klinghoffer. We've got Muslims, and of course Christians. I mean, I would say it's predominantly Christians in the movement, but when you've got all of these people of different faiths or lack of faith in the movement, then you kind of got to ask, what religion is this that we're talking about, right?
Yeah, good point.
So now I do think there are significant religious implications from intelligent design, but we must not confuse the implications of the theory with the evidence for the theory or the theory itself, because that would be incorrect. Intelligent design is not based on anything that would be considered religious. It's just based on scientific data.
Okay, yeah. I agree with you there. In my mind, this is comparable to how philosophy of religion works. That's what I tend to do a lot of my philosophical work in. And there are definitely a lot of arguments in philosophy of religion that have pretty severe religious implications. Like we talked about the Kalam cosmological argument earlier, or any argument for the existence of God. But there are serious philosophers of religion who are agnostics and atheists who work on and discuss these arguments, and everybody kind of acknowledges, well, yeah, if this argument is true, if it works, if it's valid and sound, then you've got to deal with the fact that God exists. But it doesn't prevent everybody from seriously engaging with the argument and trying to work on the logic and the evidence therein, things along those lines. I, I'm unaware of any serious atheistic philosopher of religion who dismisses the Kalam cosmological argument out of hand because if it works, it proves that there's something very much like God that exists.
Right, that would be pretty fallacious.
Exactly, and it seems to me like they're kind of doing the same thing with intelligent design, because if there is intelligent design in biology, that probably should have some pretty significant religious implications, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the argument itself is problematic.
No, right, yeah, that's exactly right. It's not based in anything religious, even if it is supportive of something religious.
Okay, awesome. Well, the next section I've got is to just talk about what the evidence is for intelligent design. Did you have anything more you wanted to say, like definitionally laying the groundwork like this before we get into that?
No, I think you hit it pretty good. There's, obviously there's a lot of different types of evolution, and we'll get more into like extended synthesis and stuff later. But I think that's basically, I think you covered it well.
Okay, fantastic. So let's just move on into the evidence. What do you think is the best evidence you could give us for intelligent design? What is it that's convinced you? Just give me your best case, your best pitch for intelligent design.
Sure. So there's a number of pieces of evidence for intelligent design, right down to the very origin of life, I would say, is one of, or even before the origin of life, right? Like we know that the fine-tuning of the universe it's extremely, it falls into a very extremely narrow life-permitting range. Mm-hmm. Well, even here, we are beginning to see evidence of intelligent design from the very origin of the universe. And I'm not like a big, huge defender of the teleological argument from the fine-tuning of the constants and the laws of physics. People like Robin Collins and William Lane Craig defend that pretty well. Mm-hmm. But even from this point, and I've even seen a lot of theistic evolutionists like Francis Collins who are willing to admit, oh yeah, we can see design, here. And so right from the get-go, so having the life-permitting conditions of the universe, we see evidence for design. You can take it to the planet itself. For example, you need to have there's a very narrow range within a galaxy. Well, first you have to have the right type of galaxy, right? If I'm not mistaken, only spiral galaxies can produce or can sustain life. So you have to have a spiral galaxy, and they're not super common. And then within a spiral galaxy, there's only a certain a narrow range in there that you can have life permitted. And then you have to have the right type of star, right? Like a yellow star, like our sun. And it has to be like the right distance from it. So, right from our very planet, we see you have to have water. So there's many, many conditions just to have a planet that can sustain life. And that doesn't even get you life. That just, gives you a place that you can have it. And then the origin of life itself, as I mentioned before, is based on DNA, which is a form of information. And so this information, in our experience, information can only come from intelligent minds. So we see evidence for intelligent design there. I guess we'll get into irreducible complexity later, but basically we have different types of organisms like the bacterial flagellum, which consist of a certain number of parts that just all have to be there. So these don't get built by small successive processes. So this is something that has to all be assembled together, and that takes foresight. And foresight is a property of intelligent beings. And not just the bacterial flagellum. We have this in other areas of life as well, like blood clotting, for example, is something that's also irreducibly complex. Then we have the origin of just new life forms that just appear out of nowhere as far as the fossil record is concerning. That takes, of course, a load of DNA to make a new animal. And so now we're not just talking about enough information to get life started. We're talking about like copious amounts of information to produce fundamentally new animals, and that happens time after time after time as far as the fossil record is concerned. We have interesting arguments from, say, like biogeography, which is the study of how animals spread over the earth. For example, in South America, we have monkeys called platyrine monkeys, and they're supposed to be descended from African catarrhine monkeys. The split happened about 30 million years ago, and the problem is these continents have been split for about 100 million years.
Oh, so how did
how do you get these monkeys over there? The most common answer is the so-called rafting hypothesis, which has a catarrhine monkey jumping on a log and floating over to South America, which is pretty out there if you ask me.
That seems pretty unlikely.
He needs fresh water to drink. He needs food to eat, and of course, one monkey can't populate South America, so you got to have another monkey on there. Don't ask me, where they slept on this log or didn't fall off or whatever. But anyway, so basically, you've got life form, and that's just one example. But we have life forms, who they're what we would predict would be their closest ancestor, are separated from that ancestor in continents that separated longer ago than the splits should have happened, suggesting that these animals appeared there fully formed, and so that coincides well with the fossil record. But again, it goes back to this question of information, and information comes from intelligent minds. So I guess there's the brief case for intelligent design.
Okay, very good. So the next question I have for you there is, how many of these things would you say, like, how many of these evidences are just like little bits of, well, not little, but like problems or gaps in evolutionary theory? Like the monkey example you cited, well, that's obviously a problem, but I can easily imagine a proponent of evolution, theistic or atheistic, could say, well, that's a problem, but maybe we're just wrong on when these monkeys supposedly diverged. Maybe it did happen 100 or 120 million years ago, and that evidence is just off, or something like that.
I mean, you could do that. That's a little ad hoc. Like, I don't even know if you would have had the monkeys in existence at that point. But the problem with that, I think, is going to be mainly, it's just basically that it's ad hoc, right? To say that it's wrong on this, it undermines the whole idea that that similarity is more of is an indicator of closer relationship, right? Because if you've got these monkeys that, if we're looking at their morphology, should be closely related to one another, then you've got them split off, and you're going to say, well, maybe this happened earlier. Well, that means that the morphology isn't telling you anything about how closely related they are to each other. So I think in order to make a hypothesis like that stick, you're going to have to abandon other common evidences for evolution, and that's probably just a price that's too high to pay.
Okay, so you have to abandon the reasons why they think it split 30 million years ago, because
you'd have to abandon the reason that you think the monkeys are related in the first place.
Okay, yeah, which that's, I guess, too high a price to pay if you're going to try and preserve the evolutionary theory to begin with. Okay, good.
It's like to solve this little problem over here, I'm going to give up, my whole, tree of life that my theory is based on, is that, all these similarities are due to common ancestry between these animals. Well, if you're going to do that, then if you have to give up this similarities an indicator of common ancestry to just solve that, why we've got a geographical problem here, then you don't even have a geographical problem to solve anymore.
Okay, yeah, good deal. That's a great point. Okay, well, is there any evidence you see that would maybe, like, you would say, yeah, that is evidence in favor of like a Darwin evolutionary theory? Is there anything you see that like points you in that direction at all, even though you're saying, but I ultimately go with ID instead? Like, do you see any other evidence for the other side, is essentially what I'm asking you there.
So the real question in this debate between intelligent design and evolution is not so much a question of evidence per se. It's a debate between how to best interpret the evidence, right? So I don't think there's a piece of evidence that you can give for evolution that doesn't fit the intelligent design framework. So are there pieces of evidence that fit within the evolutionary framework? Sure. Like if you want to bring up Darwin's finches or four-winged fruit flies or something that turn up in a laboratory experiment where we get like some small level of change, if like we have a virus that gains immunity to a certain type of antibiotic, this can be used in support of evolution. Say like, see, we got these little changes, but that fits in intelligent design too, because we don't deny that things have the ability to adapt and respond to their environments. So I don't think there's anything that doesn't fit the intelligent design paradigm. If you wanted to, like, probably the best or the most difficult thing that could probably be raised against not intelligent design as a whole, but say maybe so I don't believe that like apes and humans share a common ancestor.
Okay.
So if somebody brings up like the vitamin C pseudogene that it's supposed to be a mistake that humans and apes share, I'll say, yeah, that's probably about as strong as you can get, right? If this is really a mistake, then it's a pretty odd coincidence if both humans and apes were to share that mistake, right? So that is something that I think maybe a difficulty for at least some versions of intelligent design, like I hold to, but there aren't like any grand things against intelligent design as such.
Okay, yeah. I like what you're saying there, that it's not so much a question of evidence, but interpretation of the evidence. I think you're quite
That's really what it comes down to, yes.
I remember, I don't remember how, well, there was a online discussion I saw one time where Richard Dawkins was talking to a young Earth creationist, and she was saying, well, where's all the transitional fossils? And he was saying, oh, come with me to these museums. There's tons of them. And it was somewhere in that conversation I realized,
Richard Dawkins and Wendy Wright, yep.
Oh, you've seen that. Okay, you know exactly what I'm talking about then, yeah. And I realized when I was watching that, he thinks that all of these various fossils that look like complete animals to me are transitional. And she also thinks they're complete animals that are not transitional. So they're, in a certain sense, looking at the same evidence, but they're interpreting it radically differently.
Yeah, and I mean, I wouldn't trust Wendy Wright too much to be the best representative of intelligent design. Yeah. But
I wouldn't either. That was just an example, and I wouldn't trust Richard Dawkins as the best representation of evolutionary theory either, because I know there are many people who articulate it much better and more honestly than he does. But that was just the discussion where I realized that they're just seeing it so completely differently.
Yeah, it really is, what is the best way to interpret the data. So it's like, because it's too often when I have these discussions with people, they think it's like, I just don't know what the evidence for evolution is, right? And so they'll trot out all the old icons of evolution, and I'll say, but look, these fit within an intelligent design paradigm as well. So it's not that I don't know these pieces of information, it's that I think there's a better way of interpreting them.
Yeah. And you mentioned there that you don't think that humans and apes have a common ancestry. I heard you right, correct?
Yes, sir. I don't hold to that.
Well, I haven't quite completely made up my mind about that yet, but I have been to like the Field Museum in Chicago and the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., and I've looked at their exhibits on human evolution there, and those were the weakest evidenced exhibits they had in both of those museums, where they flat out admitted to you, if you actually read the displays, that the vast majority of the displays they had were replicas and assumed things. They didn't actually have very much in the way of fossils. As I recall, at the Smithsonian one, they had a lot of things about Neanderthals. They had a lot of physical evidence and fossils of Neanderthals. But when it came to the so-called transitional and the ones that were transitional from the common ancestry that it's assumed that humans and apes share, there was very, very little actual physical evidence. I mean, much less than there was for any other exhibit they had there. In fact, I was kind of astonished that there was so little of it, and it was such a big exhibit.
Right. And to be clear, you could accept ape to human common ancestry without accepting, universal common ancestry, or without rejecting intelligent design. So I want to be careful to say, like, you're not bound to reject this and accept intelligent design. But I mean, I'm skeptical of it. If you study paleoanthropology, that's the study of all the fossils between supposed ape to human evolution. Everything in there, it's called a hominid. So when you're studying hominid evolution, you really have like these two big categories emerge. You have the genus Homo, and you have the genus Australopithecine. All of the Homo is pretty much human, and all the Australopithecine is pretty much ape. And the central links, like they get more, as you mentioned, it gets more diverse as you go. And when you hit the three middle ones, right? When you get like Homo habilis, Homo sebdia, and Homo sebdia and Australopithecus, something or other, I'm forgetting the name. But these three middle categories are the most sparse of them all. Like, we don't have complete skeletons at all, and the bones in these categories continually get reclassified as being either Australopithecine or Homo, and they're mostly just mixes of Australopithecine and Homo bones that they don't know how to properly classify these. So we're really looking at like a mix of fully Australopithecine or fully Homo bones, and we're really missing the middle,
Okay. Yeah. I've remained pretty skeptical of human evolution in that sense, because as I said, I've been to those museums, and it doesn't seem to me like the evidence is near as strong as it's presented. Not that it's impossible or been disproven, but it seems to me they really overpresent the evidence that they have there, where, okay, I could give you there's fossils of dinosaurs, and maybe even some of them look transitional, but you've got a lot more evidence for that than you do of the common ancestor of human and apes. At least that's the way it seemed to me from what I saw.
Yeah, I mean, even on the dinosaurs, I'll argue that it's not that good, but I hear you.
Yeah, and that's fine. I'm only saying from what I saw, it looked to me they had better evidence there. Okay. So you got in. I think you got into this a little bit when you were giving your pitch for ID, but in my opinion, from what I've heard of other ID proponents, like you mentioned Stephen Meyer before, I've heard him give some lectures, and I worked my way through at least one of his books. I think that the mechanistic critiques of Darwinian evolution that ID proponents give are probably some of the strongest points that ID makes. So are you able to get into some of that a little bit? Because that's one of the things that's really gotten me thinking about it quite seriously.
Sure. So I got a quote here from John G. West, and he says, "We know what evolution can do, and it's not much." So the neo-Darwinian mechanism of mutation or random mutation coupled with natural selection is just extremely limited in what it can actually do. So you can get like small changes that help adapt organisms to their environments, but it cannot explain how you get anything fundamentally new, right? Michael Behe has a whole book on this called The Edge of Evolution, and basically Behe is using empirical data there to show that there's a decided limit to how much you can actually evolve something. There's like this built-in limit to evolvability. Now, at the time he wrote Edge of Evolution, I think that was back in 2007, he wasn't quite sure what the level was. In his newer book that just came out this year, Darwin Devolves, he thinks that he can pinpoint that this goes down to the level of family. So you cannot evolve something beyond family with mutation and natural selection. So it also turns out that mutations ultimately cause a net loss in information, right? So whenever we get an information like E. coli bacteria, right? For example, like with Richard Linsky, people like to use that as like, oh, well, look at all these great changes that we got in this bacteria here. Well, not really, because any change that you get in these things that is considered like something something, they'll say, oh, we got a new function. Well, this is always at the loss of something else. It's sort of like if you need your car to go faster, so you have to like toss out the back seat, right? And now you're able to go faster, but you've ultimately lost something. So these experiments they put forward as evidence that mutation, natural selection can give you a new function aren't promising examples because they always are at a loss of information. And so if the question is how we get new information, these are not promising examples.
Okay, good deal. So when Michael Behe said you couldn't go beyond the family, I'm not quite up to date on my biological classification of species. So would that be something like you can't have a dog evolve into something that's going to become a tiger, or how does that work exactly? What's the limit he puts on it there?
You can't cross from like dogs to cats, right? Or from a mammal to to a fish or something like that. The big families, I don't have the technical definition, but it's the major animal types, right? So like within cats, I think that's like the family. So you probably could get like tigers and lions and stuff within the cat family, but in another family, you wouldn't be able to do that or you couldn't cross between families rather because you wouldn't, because that just seems to be an edge to evolution, a limit to the evolvability there.
Okay, so what he's saying is lions and tigers may share a common ancestry, but they're not going to share a common ancestry with an iguana.
Well, Michael Behe actually believes in common ancestry.
Oh, pardon me. That's so right. So
he's fine with saying that there's a common ancestor there, but he says mutation and natural selection is not it. It doesn't. It can't get you past a certain point. Now, I actually will say, yes, they don't share a common ancestor. Oh, yeah, that's fine. I will actually say that they don't share a common ancestor with iguanas. But Behe himself, he thinks that they do, but he thinks intelligent design has to be the cause of this because mutation and natural selection, they just can't cut it.
So he was saying, I'll try this again, make sure I get it right this time. He's saying that Darwinian evolutionary processes can't get you both the lions and the tigers and an iguana from a common ancestor. You need something else to come in. With it only being Darwinian processes, then maybe you could have the lion and the tiger having the common ancestor, but it's not going to include the iguana if it's only Darwinian processes.
Right, yes, that's it.
Okay. I got it right the second time. So. Okay, so that's where I'm splitting up David and I's discussion. As so often happens when I interview people on great topics, our conversation went longer than I can fit into one podcast. This one's actually going to be a three-parter, so I'll put up the second part next week and the third part thereafter. And in the meantime, I'm going to do another quick segment of Calvin and Hobbes and philosophy. So this week, since we're talking about intelligent design and related issues along those lines, I've got a comic strip here where Calvin's got on himself a little archaeologist/paleontologist hat, and he's got a shovel, and he's pretending to dig for dinosaur bones. So Calvin and Hobbes are walking out through the woods. He's dressed, as I said, got one of those little, I don't know exactly the name of these hats, but if you watch an old archaeologist cartoon or adventurer cartoon, it's the kind of hats they're wearing. Anyhow, Calvin is saying to Hobbes, I've been reading up on paleontology. It's amazing stuff. The next panel shows him digging into the ground, and he keeps talking, and he says, scientists can tell how old something is just by analyzing the layers of dirt it's in. The next panel shows Hobbes sticking his finger on the top of Calvin's head, and Calvin looks annoyed and says, hey! And then Hobbes looks at his finger and goes, why, you must be 6 years old. Calvin readjusts his hat and says, oh, you're a scream. So, obviously the joke there is that you can't figure out how old Calvin is by how tall he is, and it's a category error because sometimes you can figure out how old a fossil is, how old a dinosaur bone is, just by the layer of rock it's in, or the layer of dirt it's in, something along those lines. Not always, but sometimes. And the joke here is that Hobbes is deliberately making a category error like that, and it it does make it a little less funny to explain the joke, but oh well. And so I found this tied into intelligent design and the issues I'm talking about, not just because of the topic, but because one of the criticisms that David brought up of people have of intelligent design is that they'll say you can't look for design in things along the lines of paleontology, biology, and stuff along those lines. But it's perfectly acceptable to look for design in forensics and archaeology and things along those lines. And so if you were to interpret that objection very charitably, what those people are saying is intelligent design advocates are making a category error here. They're looking for design in areas where it's inappropriate to do so. And what David was objecting to, and I think he's right about this, is, well, no, it's just arbitrary to say that's a category error. You have to give us some kind of a reason as to why it's a category error. You can't just rule it out arbitrarily. And the only real reason, as I said, that I found that they tend to give is to just assume from the get-go that there is no design, which is begging the question or circular reasoning, as we said. And so that's why I think this particular Calvin and Hobbes comic is relevant to this, what's going on now. Again, not a horrifically deep philosophical point, but people make category errors and things like this all the time. In fact, a lot of the best jokes you'll find people telling are things along the lines of category errors, where they're applying human traits to animals or animal traits to humans and things along those lines. And it's very funny because we all recognize it's a problem. But if you're going to say, well, that's a category error, you can't do that in this discipline, you need to have reasons why. And the reasons why it's a category error for Hobbes to say Calvin's 6 years old because of how tall he is are pretty obvious. So that's this week's episode. Let me know what you think of how the discussion on intelligent design is going. Feel free to write in and give me any kind of feedback. If you like what I'm doing on the podcast, give it a like, a rating, or subscription, or whatever's appropriate on the podcast service you're using to listen to. It's hard to keep track of how many different ways there are to interact with this stuff because it's done differently on, say, iTunes and on Spotify and so on and so forth. But if you like what I'm doing here on the podcast, share it on your social media, write in, let me know. I love getting feedback. And I'll be back again next week with the second part of David and I's discussion on intelligent design.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.